The sun beat down on the White House lawn as the press gathered for what had been billed as a routine economic update. But the energy in the air felt anything but routine. Ever since President Donald J. Trump announced the boldest tariff policy in modern history, a jaw-dropping 245% tariff on Chinese goods, the media had been in a frenzy. The administration dubbed it the American Revival Plan. Liberals called it Trade War 2.0. But today wasn't about Trump himself. It wasn't even about Vice President JD Vance, though he was nearby, shaking hands with economic advisors and Republican donors. The spotlight, surprisingly, fell on someone else, Usha Vance. A former law clerk, highly educated and deeply articulate, Usha had largely avoided the public eye since her husband became vice president. But that changed today. Scheduled to give a speech on the broader economic impact of the tariffs at the Heritage Economic Forum, her appearance had become the hottest ticket in D.C. As she approached the podium, a flurry of flashbulbs lit up the stage. Dressed in a sharp navy blue suit with the American flag subtly pinned near her heart, Usha radiated calm authority. What nobody knew was that a liberal reporter, famous for her ambush-style interviews, was waiting in the wings, ready to pounce. "Good morning, everyone," Usha began, her voice clear and confident. "When we talk about tariffs, we are not talking about numbers on a spreadsheet. We're talking about values, American jobs, American manufacturing, and American independence." Just as the crowd leaned in, the moment everyone feared, or perhaps anticipated, happened. "Excuse me, Mrs. Vance," interrupted Lindsay Carver, a progressive journalist known for her aggressive style and TikTok viral confrontations. Holding a microphone like a sword, she pushed her way through the crowd. "How can you stand there and support what is clearly an economically illiterate policy? Americans are already seeing prices rise. Isn't this hurting the very working-class people your husband claims to care about?" The room tensed. JD Vance, watching from a distance, clenched his jaw slightly but remained still. He knew Usha didn't need his help. Usha turned slowly toward the reporter, maintaining a serene smile. "Lindsay, thank you for your question. And I understand your concern. But allow me to take you and everyone here on a journey through the truth behind these tariffs." The reporter chuckled dismissively. "Oh, this should be good." Usha continued undeterred. "Let me start by saying this: no great nation has ever remained great by outsourcing its lifeblood. For decades, America traded away its manufacturing power, our jobs, our technologies, even our leverage, all in the name of short-term savings." She gestured to a large screen behind her as it flashed an image of shuttered factories in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. "We were told globalization would uplift everyone. But all it did was centralize power in the hands of multinational corporations and foreign governments, especially China." The crowd murmured in agreement, many nodding. Lindsay rolled her eyes. "That's rich coming from someone who buys luxury handbags probably made in Asia." Without missing a beat, Usha replied, "Actually, my handbag was made in Kentucky. And unlike you, I've visited the people who made it." The Trump tariffs are already bringing investment back to towns that the media forgot and the elites abandoned. There was a ripple of applause. Usha was just warming up. And yes, prices may rise temporarily. But do you know what else rises? Wages. Pride. Independence. You can't put a price on national security or economic sovereignty. Lindsay tried to interject again, but Usha held up her hand. "I'll get to your other points, Lindsay. But first, let's look at the data, real data, not Twitter trends or cable news hysteria." The crowd leaned in. Even critics knew something special was unfolding. The screen behind Usha Vance lit up again, this time showing a graph with sharp dips and gradual climbs. A red line marked the years before the tariffs, a bold green one showed the months following President Trump's new trade policy. "Let's talk about facts," Usha said calmly, looking straight at Lindsay Carver, who now stood with crossed arms and a cocked eyebrow. Since the tariffs were enacted, over 137 American companies have either brought manufacturing back to the U.S. or invested in domestic supply chains. She tapped a button on her clicker. "Let's zoom in on the Midwest. Ohio, where JD and I come from, has seen a 22% increase in small-scale manufacturing jobs just in the last 8 months. That's not an opinion, Lindsay. That's Bureau of Labor Statistics data." Murmurs of approval rumbled through the room. A few attendees even started clapping. Lindsay wasn't backing down. "And what about inflation? Working families are paying more for basic goods. Are you saying that's acceptable collateral damage?" Usha took a slow breath. "That's the easy soundbite, isn't it? What you won't report is that much of the inflation we're seeing now is residual from pre-existing supply chain chaos, pandemic disruptions, and endless money printing before Trump returned to office. She walked away from the podium, approaching the front row and speaking more personally now. What we're doing with these tariffs isn't about short-term gratification. It's a strategic reset, a long overdue economic detox. The screen now showed an aerial view of a bustling American factory with workers on assembly lines. These tariffs are not punitive, they're protective. And yes, protectionism works when it's smart, targeted, and enforced by a president who actually understands leverage. Usha locked eyes with the crowd. Every administration before us, Democrat and Republican, allowed China to eat our lunch. Why? Cheap labor. Lower costs. But what did we lose? Our industries, our dignity, and worst of all, our leverage. She paused and turned toward Lindsay again. China has relied on the American consumer to build its empire. We've subsidized their rise for decades. Now, for the first time, we're saying no more. And guess what? They're panicking. The screen displayed headlines from Chinese state media. China retaliates with counter-tariffs, U.S. markets adjust to new trade reality, and Beijing rattled by Trump's economic nationalism. Lindsay tried again, more frustrated this time. You're making it sound like a chess game. Real people are struggling while you play geopolitical Monopoly. Usha stepped back to the podium. Let me tell you about real people, Lindsay. Last week, I visited a factory in Youngstown that reopened because of these tariffs. I met a man named Ray. He's a father of 4 who had been on disability and unemployment for nearly a decade after the steel plant shut down. She paused for effect. Ray is working again. He told me he gets up every morning before the sun rises and thanks God that he's not collecting a government check anymore. He's earning. He's providing. And he said, quote, "Tell President Trump that China ain't stealing my job again." Applause erupted. Lindsay smirked, heartwarming anecdote. But is one factory worth a 245% hike on imports? Usha smiled coolly. It's not one factory. It's hundreds. And what's the alternative? Continuing to be economically dependent on a regime that spies on us, steals from us, and undercuts our businesses. She leaned forward. You think the 245% tariff is extreme? I think it's the minimum price for freedom. Suddenly, the crowd was on its feet. Even some moderate journalists glanced at each other, visibly stunned. It wasn't just that Usha had answered the question. She had owned it, dissected it, then flipped it on its head. But she wasn't done. These tariffs are not just economic policies, Usha said as the applause died down. They're national security strategies. They're declarations of independence. And they are investments in our future, in our workers, in our children's ability to grow up in an America that makes things again. Lindsay didn't respond. For the first time in her career, she had no follow-up. The media scrum had quieted. The clatter of camera shutters slowed. Even the White House staffers standing offstage were watching in awe. Usha Vance had done more than deflect an ambush. She had taken control of the entire narrative. But now she pivoted. Not content to stay in defense mode, Usha began to paint a vision for what America could become, not just under Trump, but under a new economic paradigm rooted in strength, sovereignty, and self-respect. Let's talk about the bigger picture, she began. Her voice now filled with passionate conviction. Tariffs are a means to an end, not the end itself. This isn't about revenge on China. It's about America reclaiming its ability to chart its own destiny. She clicked her remote and the screen behind her displayed 2 maps side by side, one of global supply chains in 2010, the other in 2025. Look at this. Just 15 years ago, nearly 80% of all electronics sold in the U.S. passed through Chinese factories. That included smartphones, laptops, routers, and microchips. We were dangerously reliant on a nation that not only opposes our values but sees us as an obstacle to its global ambitions. The crowd was silent, watching. But now, thanks to these tariffs and the reinvestment incentives President Trump pushed through Congress, many of which JD helped write, we've reversed that dependency by nearly 40%. And in some sectors, we've achieved full supply chain independence. The image changed to a montage of new American chip fabs in Arizona, Texas, and Ohio. Drones delivering goods from warehouses staffed by American workers. Young people attending vocational training programs sponsored by newly returned companies. This is about more than just jobs. It's about reclaiming our economic sovereignty. Because when we control our production, we control our destiny. Lindsay, who had regained some composure, spoke again, but this time with noticeably less arrogance. But isn't there a risk that China's retaliation could spiral into something worse, maybe even collapse global trade? Usha nodded thoughtfully. That's a valid question. But let me flip it on you, how sustainable was the old model? We allowed a communist regime to monopolize manufacturing, undercut our workers, and buy up our farmland, real estate, and even media outlets, all while dumping fentanyl into our streets and hacking our infrastructure. She let that sink in. That wasn't peace. That was surrender. President Trump said enough was enough. And now the world knows America is done playing nice with those who play dirty. The screen behind her now showed a headline from the Wall Street Journal: China's economic growth slows amid U.S. tariffs and reshored supply chains. Usha turned back to the crowd, her tone now earnest and inspiring. Do you know what's happening in Beijing right now? Panic. They underestimated us. They thought we'd cave. But we're not folding, we're doubling down. And the world is watching. Europe is starting to adopt similar policies. India is rethinking its trade agreements. Even Canada is reconsidering its reliance on Chinese tech. She paused, then leaned into the microphone, her voice soft but firm. Trump's tariffs aren't just economic policy, they're a global declaration. America is back. And we're not outsourcing our future. The room erupted again. Reporters whispered to each other. Political analysts watching the live stream were tweeting furiously. Even some center-left pundits couldn't deny it. Usha Vance had just reshaped the tariff debate overnight. But she wasn't finished yet. Now, I know there will be challenges, she continued, acknowledging the complexity. There will be price adjustments. There will be growing pains. But tell me, what meaningful change in history didn't come with sacrifice? The screen behind her displayed a powerful image. Rosie the Riveter next to a modern-day steelworker in a hard hat. Fists clenched. This is our moment. Just like the greatest generation, we too are called to build, protect, and preserve our nation. Not just with words, but with work. A standing ovation erupted. The energy was electric. JD Vance, watching from backstage, smiled with pride. He had seen Usha rise through the ranks of elite institutions, but nothing compared to this moment. She wasn't just the second lady of the United States. She was becoming a force in her own right. And as Usha left the podium, she paused briefly beside Lindsay Carver. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply said, "If you want to do a follow-up story, I'll take you to Youngstown myself. Mic, drop." The moment the press conference ended, clips of Usha Vance's dismantling of the Liberal reporter flooded social media. Hashtags like #TariffTruthBomb, #UshaUnleashed, and #AmericaFirstEconomics trended across X, Rumble, and YouTube. On conservative talk shows, pundits replayed her speech like a battle hymn. Even moderate Democrats admitted, grudgingly, that Usha had presented the most compelling case yet for Trump's aggressive trade war strategy. But what surprised the nation most wasn't the media reaction. It was the public response. The next morning, outside the reopened steel mill in Youngstown, a crowd of workers gathered, holding signs that read, "Thank you Trump and USHA," and "Build here, not there." It wasn't organized by a campaign or a PAC. It was spontaneous, organic patriotism in action. One local welder, an ex-Bernie voter named Joey Ramirez, spoke to a local station. "I didn't vote for Trump the first time. I believed all the talk about him being a billionaire who didn't care about guys like me. But these tariffs? Man, they gave me my job back." And Usha, she gets it. She's not just talking politics. She's fighting for us. In response, Usha and JD Vance embarked on an unplanned national tour, something they dubbed the American Renewal Roadshow. Their goal? To bring the real story of Trump's tariffs directly to the people the mainstream media refused to show. From the Rust Belt to the South, Usha visited textile workers in North Carolina, steelworkers in Indiana, electronics assemblers in Arizona, and small business owners in Michigan. And at every stop, she echoed a single powerful message. These tariffs are not a tax on you, they're a tax on tyranny. They're the price we pay to make America free again. Meanwhile, in D.C., Democrats scrambled to respond. Senator Chuck Schumer tried to discredit the movement by labeling it economic nationalism at its worst. But the line fell flat. Even some of his own union-friendly colleagues pushed back, quietly telling him, "Our voters like what she's saying." Back at the White House, President Trump was thrilled. During an off-camera moment in the West Wing, he told JD with his usual flair, "Your wife, she's tremendous. One of the best we've got. She's like Reagan and Margaret Thatcher rolled into one. Maybe she should run next." JD laughed, but in truth he'd been thinking the same thing. While the liberal media tried desperately to poke holes in the tariff boom, the numbers kept rolling in. Over 250 U.S. companies had announced plans to shift operations out of China and back to U.S. soil. National unemployment had dropped to its lowest level in a decade. Consumer confidence reached a 12-year high, particularly in manufacturing-heavy states. And in a moment of unexpected irony, even China's state-run television aired a segment warning that American economic aggression is triggering a global manufacturing reshuffle. But Usha wasn't interested in global panic. She was focused on American pride. At a major rally in Toledo, Ohio, she stood beside a local mom-and-pop furniture maker that had just reopened after 17 years of dormancy. "We got priced out by Chinese plywood," the owner had told her. "Now, thanks to Trump's tariffs, we're hiring again." In her speech to the crowd, Usha addressed the criticisms head-on. Yes, tariffs can be uncomfortable in the short term. But you know what's more uncomfortable? Having no industry, no leverage, and no future. If we want to raise strong families, grow real wealth, and stand tall on the world stage, then we have to produce, not just consume. We have to make America build again. She paused, then added something that would be quoted for weeks to come. Trump's tariffs aren't just economic policy, they're a declaration of love for the American worker. The crowd roared. Flags waved. Fireworks burst overhead. That night, CNN reluctantly aired a segment titled, "Are Trump's tariffs actually working?" The panel was split. One anchor said it was all smoke and mirrors. Another admitted if this keeps up, 2026 might be a landslide. And in a quiet moment after the rally, Usha sat beside JD in their motorcade and looked out the window. "These people aren't just numbers or political props," she said softly. "They're the heartbeat of the country. And they're finally being heard." JD nodded. "Because you gave them a voice?" It was the 4th of July, 2025. The National Mall was bursting with color and patriotism, American flags waved, choirs sang from stages, and crowds roared with excitement as jets thundered overhead. But this Independence Day had a different energy. It wasn't just a celebration of history, it was the birth of a new era. Usha Vance stood on the stage next to Vice President JD Vance and President Donald Trump. They weren't just commemorating the Founding Fathers, they were now recognized as key architects of America's second economic revolution. The media, once skeptical, now couldn't ignore the transformation. Unemployment was at a historic low, blue-collar wages had surged, and thousands of factories had reopened or been built from scratch. For the first time in decades, young Americans were choosing trade schools and vocational training over student debt. And at the heart of that movement stood Usha Vance, former law professor, mother of 3, and now a household name in American politics. As the crowd quieted, Usha stepped up to the microphone, dressed in a deep blue blazer with a subtle American flag pin. She looked over the sea of faces, families, workers, veterans, and entrepreneurs, people she had visited, spoken with, fought for. "My fellow Americans," she began, "it wasn't that long ago that we were told decline was inevitable. That manufacturing jobs were gone forever. That globalism was a one-way road and that we were the ones who had to pay the toll." A pause. She scanned the crowd. "Well, we rejected that lie. We chose a different road. And under President Trump's leadership, we made the bold decision to fight for our future." Cheers erupted. Chants of USA. USA thundered. She continued, "I was told by one reporter that the tariffs would backfire. That we'd suffer and China would dominate. But I ask you, does suffering look like job growth? Does pain look like new steel mills, like booming towns, like American families once again thriving?" Another burst of applause. President Trump leaned back, arms crossed, smiling like a proud coach watching his MVP. "But more importantly," Usha said, her voice growing stronger, "we've reawakened a spirit that was always inside us. A belief that America is not just a market, it's a nation. And our strength doesn't come from what we import, it comes from what we create." She raised her hand toward a group of workers wearing hard hats in the front row. "You men and women, you are America's muscle. The farmers, the builders, the engineers, the small business owners. You are not forgotten. You are not dismissed. You are essential. And these tariffs? These policies? They're for you." Camera crews zoomed in. Even networks that had once smeared her as JD Vance's soft-spoken wife now acknowledged she had become a dominant political figure in her own right. She turned toward President Trump and smiled. "Mr. President, you were mocked. They said tariffs would trigger collapse. Instead, they triggered a revival. A renaissance of American greatness. And we're just getting started." As fireworks began to explode above the Capitol dome, Usha ended her speech with the words that would be etched into the hearts of millions. We've proven that American decline was a choice and we chose victory. The Trump tariffs weren't just a policy, they were a promise. A promise that America will never again be at the mercy of foreign powers. That we will build, trade, and lead on our own terms. And to those who doubt the long-term benefit of standing strong, just look around. Look at our jobs. Look at our families. Look at our pride. This is not the end. This is the beginning of America's next great chapter. The crowd exploded in applause. That night, Usha Vance trended worldwide, not because of scandal or drama, but because of hope. Pollsters released fresh numbers. 64% of Americans now supported tariffs on China. A bipartisan group of lawmakers proposed expanding tariff legislation with long-term industrial policy support. And Usha herself? She was being quietly whispered as a future presidential contender, perhaps the first lady or second lady to rise not just by proximity, but by merit and fire. As she watched the fireworks beside JD and their children, her husband took her hand and said, "You didn't just defend the policy, you gave it a soul." She smiled. "No, we did." And as the final burst of red, white, and blue lit the Washington sky, America stood not just united, but reawakened.